Hello gang, SharpShot21 here, and we are finally getting back into the mini-series. This week we're getting the head installed. I already put the gasket on. I'm now dropping the head down. When you put the head down, there are two hollow dowels that should be in the block. Those are the alignment dowels for the head. Some heads have dowel pins on some engines. Other heads have hollow dowels that you will drop bolts through and help sandwich everything together. This head has the hollow dowels. Again, they're in the block. Careful when you align them up. They're also helpful for getting the head gasket aligned. The head gaskets on these are an MLS, or multi-layered steel gasket. So do be careful about not pinching them, dropping them, squishing them. Don't get any creases in them. If yours shows up with a crease or a kink, don't use it. Send it back. Get a fresh one. Now I am going to be using, I believe these are OEM studs, and you do want to oil them just a light coating of engine oil. That'll help with proper torquing on these bolts. You also want to make sure that the bolt holes in the engine are clean and dry before you start to put any fasteners in, because these are going to quite a high torque value. I don't remember what they are exactly, but the torque value on these bolts is very high. Give me a second and I'll find out what it is. Get these bolts in there by hand with a little bit of oil on each of them, and then snug them all up with a socket, but don't start to tighten them. There's a very specific torque sequence, which you'll see here. It is again, a 3-step torquing sequence, or a 4-step torquing sequence actually with these guys, I think. But anyway, you get these things run in there, you get them drop down. I'll give you the Newton meters setting for these things. A good torque wrench will have both, and it depends on kind of what your torque wrench is. But your stage 1 on these is for all the M10 bolts. It is, no, excuse me, it's a 3-stage. But it's for all the M10 bolts, so those are the thickest ones. Tighten it to 30 Newton meters, which is 22 foot-pounds. That doesn't sound right. Hold on, I may pull this up correctly. Something's not smelling correct. Yeah, and don't cheap out on these. These are single-use engines, or single-use head bolts. They are torque to yield fasteners, so that's what steps 2 are. Steps 2 and 3. And then again, there's a sequence. So this is 30 to 40 Newton meters, so 22 to 30 foot-pounds. But then you put another 90 degrees turn on them, and then another 90 degrees turn on them. That's what gives the yield. because once those bolts have yielded, it is not something that can be used again. Putting that extra 180 degrees rotation once you've torqued them, that stretches them right to the limit and almost past their elastic deformation and into plastic deformation, where they start to lose strength. And that's just me grabbing the right E-type Torx, because these are E-type Torx bolts. So they are things that need to be replaced every time. Some people say you can get away with it. I think I paid $50 for a set of OEM ones off of ECS Tuning. Not a sponsor, but that's what I paid for them. Okay, there's a torque wrench. I already got it set. That will... Okay, yeah, it's not very much. So I'm going to go with 30 to 40 Newton meters. Again, I have a manual. Go get the Bentley manual for these things. Maybe I'm just snuggling down with that ratchet before I get going. There's also 2 bolts inside the timing cover side of things, and then there's one outside the head that also gets torqued down. Those ones are let me see. So the 2 inside the timing cover go to 21 foot-pounds or 28 Newton meters. Yeah, the heads, the 10mm head bolts are 30 foot-pounds or 40 Newton meters. The ones that really get torqued down are the cam gear, but I think we do those in another video. And then everything gets 90 degrees put on it. Yeah, so here's where I'm torquing in sequence. You want to start at the middle and work your way out in kind of a spiral pattern. And then the timing cover bolts and the one outside the timing cover are done last, kind of. Yeah, see, that one's done last. And then the 2 deep inside the timing cover are done after that. But you work from the cylinder 2, 3 bolts out in a spiral. And then it is torqued to yield 90 degrees and 90 degrees, again in that pattern. My torque angle gauge hadn't come in yet, so I just do this by eyeball. If you don't know what 90 degrees is, you should be able to figure it out. I start it with the ratchet as parallel to the long axis of the engine as I can get it, and then I get it as parallel to the short side of the engine as I can get it. I think that's just me looking for another socket extension or ratchet extension. Also, when you're torquing something like this, notice how I've got the head of the ratchet braced. That is to prevent snapping of the fastener or having the socket jump off of the bolt, because that will damage things. There are journals in here for the cams. Those need to be clean and scratch free. It's just good practice. If you can brace it opposite of how you're applying torque, that's best. I know it's not always something that is feasible, but it's worth trying to do. So this is the first set of 90. And if you look, they're getting tight. And we'll finish up with these two again. And then I think we'll do it one more time. Now the whole point of this, we'll do it one more time, is to ensure proper crush of the head gasket so that it seals between the head and the block. If it doesn't seal between the head and the block, you're going to get exhaust gases into your coolant, coolant into your cylinder, coolant into your oil, oil into your coolant, flood your cylinders with both. It's not a good process. For those curious, the car up on the lift is our 84 VW Jetta. It's a Mark 1, I believe. And it is, what Dad's doing is replacing the wheel bearings. Interesting trick on the wheel bearings. I know it's tangent. If you get the inner race out of the wheel bearing and all the balls out, but you can't get the outer race out of the knuckle, take a MIG welder or a flux core welder and run a bead of weld or two around the inside of the bearing race, and that ring of weld will actually shrink it so that you can pull it out. So it's a neat little trick using the thermal properties of metal. So that's what he was doing earlier. Anyways, we're just about finished up with this portion of it. And then once this is done, we will get into putting in the cams. Those are fairly straightforward to do. But there are some tricky little nuances that you need to know about and need to follow. So yeah, that is the head torqued on. Now, time for the cam installation. Now, so what I've got in my hand there is a bottle of what is called assembly lube. It is a thicker synthetic oil modified with some friction modifiers so that it helps engines on initial break-in after they've been assembled for the first time or reassembled after a machining job where there is no oil in any of the galleries or passages. Though if you can, you should always prime an engine. This one is rather difficult to prime before spinning it over, so assembly lube is especially important on this. And the first thing to go back into the engine here and into the head are the rocker and hydraulic lifter combination units for this engine, because it's a dual overhead cam. Like I say, yeah, you can see Dad welding. That's what he's doing. He's getting a little bit of bead inside the ball joint. Or not the ball joint, the wheel bearing. Anyways, back to this. This engine is a dual overhead cam. So you've got one cam for exhaust valves, one cam for intake valves. Fairly straightforward. How that design operates, for those that aren't familiar, is the cams on these push down on the rockers. One side of the rocker is on the valve, and the other side is attached to a hydraulic lifter so that there's the proper spacing between the rocker body and the cam lobe. Those lifters are controlled by the oil pressure generated by the engine, and so you won't have pressure when you first start this engine up. Granted, we pulled the fuel the fuel pump relay out and cranked it over a few times, so it wasn't going to run, and that let us build oil pressure. Regardless, put assembly lube on everything that you can that is usually going to be an oiled surface. This will ensure that when you do put it back together, you've minimized your chances for extra wear and tear on the engine parts and binding of parts. I went through a whole bottle of assembly lube, not on this one, but when I rebuilt the Jeep engine. Put it on every surface that has something spinning against it. The exception to the assembly lube rule is on pistons. Pistons get oil. Other than that, it's assembly lube. So we get through putting all these in. It's a little bit of a tedious process because there is one for every valve. There are 4 valves per engine, or per cylinder, so there are 16 valves and lifters total in this thing. I think they do also clip on to the end of the valve stem. I could be misremembering that point. Just make sure they get seated in the lifter gets seated in the lifter gallery, and the end of the rocker arm is over the correct valve. Okay, I might only do one side on video here. So here I'm putting assembly lube on the cam journals. So that's where the camshaft sits and spins. We're doing the intake side right now. But you want to spread this out and get a good thick film going over every surface. And then where the upper half of the journal is, you want to make sure that's clean. So, one's an intake. No. I'm going to lube up the cam too, both the cam journals and the cam lobes. That way, you are sure that what you have, again, everything's usually coated in oil. Everything should get coated in assembly. It's sticky, it's messy, it's worth it. So I think maybe I'm just doing the journals right now, but I do eventually do the lobes too. And be careful when you set these down. You do not want to score or mark or ding the journals. As such, be gentle. Okay, and here's the caps. Now remember, when you take all this stuff out, you marked it, which way it came out, which journal position it was, all that fun stuff. We did that for a reason. Now we jumped a little bit ahead here. I think, yes, I have the journal caps on, or the bearing caps on, and now we are setting the timing for the cams. So setting the timing for the cams, what that does is it makes sure that the valves are going to be in the correct position for where the pistons are. that does is it makes sure that when we finally tie the crankshaft into the camshafts, they're all in the same orientation. And when the engine is doing a compression stroke, it's actually doing a compression stroke. So that's kind of important to do. We'll touch more on that in the next one.